People tend to ask me a lot about urban legends, like the Rake and the Wendigo. I can't honestly say that I know much about them, but based on the light reading I've done, I can say that some of the stories I've been told definitely sound related. I'm sure you've heard the old adage that urban legends all have a kernel of truth. While I'm sure that's slightly true, I do try to take these things with a grain of salt. You have to out here. It's sort of like working in a hospital, I imagine. You could spend all day thinking about how many people have died there, and how there are probably ghosts or spirits or whatever you want to call them everywhere, but it doesn't do you any good. It just makes it harder to do your job. I think a lot of us feel that way, and that's why we just do our best to go about work like everything is fine. Once you let yourself get paranoid, there's no going back, and a lot of cadets quit because of it. My park in particular seems to have a high turnover rate. Cadets get so freaked out about everything after graduating that they can't seem to let it go. If you want to continue in the job, you just need to learn to internalize these things and continue on. I've been talking to Katie a bit more about her experiences because I was curious about her thoughts on the Wendigo. She didn't have much to say about it herself, except for the fact that it was something she did not like to think about. But she did let me know that one of her friends may have some insight. I ended up getting in contact with her friend over Skype, and they agreed to tell me more about their experience. They know I've been sharing these stories online, so they gave me permission to post the following story. I grew up in Central Oregon, about 2 hours from a reservation called Warm Springs. A lot of people in my area have friends there, and quite a bit of the land around there belongs to the tribe. When I was a kid, we used to go camping up there. Not on the reservation itself, of course, but I did end up meeting a lot of kids who grew up there. I got to know one kid named Nolan really well, so we'd get in touch and camp out around the same time with our families. We'd typically camp for about 2 weeks, so we were out there for a while at a time. My dad had an RV, but I preferred being outside, so Nolan and I would take our tents and set them up away from camp most nights. One summer, when we were around 12, Nolan and I were out there and wanted to go camp out near the river because we wanted to try night fishing. We must have been about 1/3 of a mile from the camp, far enough away that we couldn't hear or see anyone else. I remember that. We were messing around most of the day and ended up building a fire at some point. I was really impressed. He had this flint or something that he used to start it. I had never seen anyone do that before, so I thought it was pretty cool. I got him to teach me how to use it, and we lit some stuff on fire, which, looking back, was pretty stupid because it was the middle of the fucking summer, and if I remember correctly, the fire warning was either at yellow or orange. Thankfully, we didn't start anything major, and when it got dark, we sat around and talked for a while. At some point, Nolan looked over my shoulder at the river and asked me if I could see something over there. Our camp was set up about 10 feet from the river, and we were at the widest point, so it was probably about 20 feet to the other bank. It gets hot up there in the summer, but the water is still really cold, which is important to the story. I looked over my shoulder, and I could see something wading into the river from the other side. It looked like a deer from where we were, but we couldn't completely make out the shape because of the fire. I got up to look closer and saw a pair of antlers, so I figured it was a buck, but I thought it was weird that it was wading into the water, and it was definitely heading for us, so I asked Nolan what he thought we should do. He was looking at the fire with this weird expression, and told me to just sit down and shut up. I listened because I had never seen him act that way before. He was whispering at me to ignore it, to just keep talking like we were before, but I couldn't think of anything to say. He kept trying to say something about an episode of a show we had been talking about, but I could hear the deer coming through the water towards us. I wasn't really paying attention since I was trying to see over his shoulder. Every time I tried to get a look at an animal, he'd sort of hit me on the arm and make me look at him. I wasn't really scared. I just remember being confused, until I realized it wasn't a deer. I heard it come out of the water, and when I could make out its shape, I saw that it was walking on 2 legs. I was super freaked out, so I started to get up, but Nolan just yanked me back down and talked louder about this television show, and I could tell he was just as scared as I was, probably even more. He leaned in and poked the fire with his stick, and he whispered that whatever I do, I can't speak to it. I could see it come closer until it was right behind Nolan's back. I was just about ready to pee my pants. I think I would have run away if I was alone, but I didn't want to leave Nolan, so I just sat as still as possible, sneaking occasional glances at it. It wasn't that tall, but the way it carried itself was just wrong. Like its center of balance was all screwed up. I can't really describe it, but it was kind of like it kept shifting too far forward. It just stood there behind Nolan for a long time, and eventually Nolan ran out of things to say, and we just sat there for a second, not really sure what to do. I thought I could hear this thing talking in a really low voice over the noise of the fire. I couldn't hear what it was saying, so I leaned forward a tiny bit. I actually did pee my pants when it leaned forward too. I couldn't see its face, but I saw its eyes. They were cloudy and milky, like that scene from The Lord of the Rings where Frodo falls into that lake with all the dead people floating around him. That's what its eyes looked like. All I could see were those two white eyes floating above Nolan's head, and the vague shape of antlers coming out. Nolan must have seen the fear in my eyes because we both got up and booked it out of there at the same time, and we ran non-stop until we got back to the main camp. My pants were soaked with pee, so I took them off as we were running and threw them in the bushes. We both stopped once we were in front of my dad's RV, and we couldn't see anything else chasing us, and stayed there for a while to catch our breath. I asked him what that thing was, but he said he didn't know. He said his grandpa only warned him that if anything ever came up to him when he was out in the desert, he was never, ever supposed to talk to it or listen to anything it had to say. I asked if he heard it talking too, and he told me the only thing he was able to understand were the words, "help you." I think we ended up sleeping in the RV with my parents the rest of the night, and the next night, when we went back into the woods, we didn't see anything out of the ordinary. That story from Katie's friend reminded me a lot of the Wendigo legend. I've heard this phrase that I think fits well. The Wendigo is the spirit of lonely places. I know that sometimes when I'm out in the wilds, where I know there's no one around me for miles and miles, I get this weird craving I can't explain. I don't know if this happens to anyone else, but it's this desire to consume. It's not like I crave anything in particular. It's more like this weird, distracting hunger that comes from every part of my gut. I was also pretty curious about the faceless man legend, so I asked around my circle of friends. One of them told me that while he was out doing repairs at a park in his area, he saw something that could be related, and told me this story. I was repainting an information booth and heard a man ask me for directions to the nearest campsite. I didn't turn around since I was up on a ladder, but I let him know there weren't any campsites nearby. I told him he could head down the road about 4 miles and he should find one at another park. He didn't respond, so I asked him if I could help him with anything else. He said no, and then thanked me, so I just continued painting. I thought it was weird, though. I never heard the man leave after thanking me. The second he had walked up and talked to me, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I wasn't really sure why. I just had this really uneasy feeling about the whole thing. All I wanted to do was finish up painting and get out of there. I figured it was just because I couldn't turn around to look at him, but something felt seriously off. There was also this weird smell floating around, even before the guy started talking to me, kind of like old period blood. I glanced around to see what might be causing it, but didn't really see anything. I tried to continue painting, but I still didn't hear this guy leave, which made me feel like he was just standing there, watching me. I asked again if I could do anything for him, and he didn't answer. I knew he was there, though, so I did this awkward turn on the ladder to look down and see what he was doing. Now, I admit it could have just been my mind playing tricks on me, but I swear to you, for a split second when I turned around, that fucker didn't have a face. Like, no face at all. It was almost concave, totally smooth, and I just about had a fucking heart attack because I couldn't wrap my head around what I was seeing. I think I started to say something, but there was this kind of pop inside my head, and suddenly he was just a normal-looking guy. I must have looked at him funny because he asked if I was okay, and I was just like, yeah, I'm fine. He asked me about the campsite again, and I pointed to where he had to go, and he was like, I'm not from around here, can you help me get there? Now, this is where I know something is really up, because there's no way this guy got out here in the first place and didn't know where he was. For that matter, there was no car around, so how did he get out here in the first place? I said I was sorry, but I couldn't take him anywhere in the company vehicle, but this guy was practically begging. So now I'm seriously weirded out, and I start wondering if this was some kind of ambush or whatever. I told him I could call him a taxi to take him where he wanted to go, but when I pulled out my phone, he just said no, and walked away really quickly. But he didn't walk out of the park. He walked back into the fucking trees, so I got right into my truck and got out of there. Fuck the paint or whatever. I looked in my mirror to see where he was as I was leaving, and he's just standing at the tree line again. I don't know how he got there so fast, but this time, I knew he didn't have a face. He was just watching me leave, and right before I turned the corner, he took a big step back into the trees and kind of dissolved, I guess. Maybe it was just so dark that he blended in, but it felt more like he just melted away. Interestingly, right after this guy finished his story, someone else piped up with another similar one, but with a slightly different twist. You know, actually, I had something sort of weird like that happen to me a while back too. I was out doing some trail scouting, and I was out in the middle of nowhere figuring out where we were going to have this trail run through. I hadn't seen anyone else for probably a good 2 hours, so I wasn't really paying attention to where I was going. I was just looking at the ground for the most part. Then, out of nowhere, I crested this little hill and almost ran into this guy. He was older, probably in his 60s, and I started to apologize for running into him. But then I noticed his face. I probably looked like a complete douchebag because I just stopped and stared at him. It took me a second to figure out what was wrong, but this guy's face was huge. I know it sounds weird, but that's the only way I can describe it. His head wasn't big or anything, it was normal sized, but the amount of space that his face took up was just way too much. Like if you took someone's face and enlarged it all by about 2 times. He didn't say anything, he just looked back at me, and I backed up and was kind of stuttering and saying I was sorry. I went around him and got the fuck out of there and did what I needed to do. The whole time, I kept looking behind me because I was so freaked out that he'd pop up behind me or something. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I swear to you, it was one of the creepiest things I've ever seen. A little while later in the conversation, I switched the topic back to the stairs, and there was a definite shift in enthusiasm. No one spoke up at first. There's a real stigma around discussing them, even when we're away from work. But I broke the ice with a story of my own, and the guy who told us about the faceless man told me this one, albeit very quietly. A couple years ago, I was camping with my girlfriend. We were about 2 miles from the road at this site I know. We went to bed that night, but we couldn't sleep because we kept hearing this grinding noise. My brother used to grind his teeth in his sleep, and it kind of reminded me of that. My girlfriend was freaking out, but I just kept telling her to ignore it because I've heard it before out in the woods, and you just have to ignore those types of things. It goes away eventually. You guys know what I mean. After a while, I got her to go to sleep, but I woke up about 2 hours later and something just felt off. I rolled over and she wasn't there, and I kind of freaked out because... Anyway, I ran out of the tent calling her name, but I didn't have to go far. She was standing at the edge of the camp, looking at something in the trees, and I saw that she was really pale. The fire was low, but just bright enough for me to see her. I ran up to see what was going on, and she was dead asleep, but her eyes were wide open. She had this spaced out look, so I put my arm around her and led her back to the tent, but she wouldn't move. She just said something really quietly, something like, "I have to go now, Eddie. I have to go. It's here." I just told her she was sleepwalking and that she should come back to bed, but she wouldn't budge. She just kept standing there and saying she had to go. I looked where she was looking, and there was a fucking staircase right there, about 15 yards away. A gray one, concrete. She started to walk towards it, but I yanked her back, and that finally woke her up. She looked at me like I was out of my fucking mind, and she asked what the fuck she was doing out of the tent. I didn't tell her anything, just let her know that she had been sleepwalking. The grinding was gone, so she went back to the tent and fell asleep without any problems. I don't know. I just don't like thinking about it, You guys remember that kid with... I can't remember what it was, some kind of disorder. Not Downs, but something like it. Well, I got to read the report he gave when they found him a week later after he went missing, and it was fucked up beyond belief. I mean, you have to take it with a grain of salt because who knows what this kid actually thought was real, but some of this stuff, I don't think he could have made up. Like, first of all, he talked about the stairs. He said he'd been watching his dad build a fire, and the stairs came up to him, and he had to go up them or something bad would happen. The cops couldn't really understand what he was talking about after that because he just kept saying, like the campfire. He kept saying it over and over. And he mentioned sounds, but he couldn't say what sounds, just that it was loud, and he covered his ears so he couldn't hear them. But the thing I remember most is that they asked him exactly where he'd gone, and he just said he was right there. He kept pointing at himself, and they thought that meant he thought he had never left. He said he wasn't scared because the stairs were there, and he said they talked to him, but not like people talk. Like I said, it was really convoluted and hard to understand, and I have a feeling the cops didn't take most of it down. They ended up just saying that the kid had some kind of amnesia, and they didn't think foul play was involved. Doesn't really explain why he came back a week later perfectly fine, without a speck of dirt on him and well fed, but hey, what the cops say goes. There are still a lot of questions I want to answer. I'll continue to ask around and find out whatever I can, and my next update should be soon. Thanks for being so patient.